It's a great pleasure to be here. So my name is Dr. Rob Phillips. I work in the Design Futures program. I'm also the principal investigator on the Ecological Citizens Project, funded by the UKRI. And it's brilliant to be here alongside John V. Willshire, who is my co-course leader for the Futures Through Design course, and also Charlie Warwick, Associate Director of Foresight at Arup, and pioneering consultant and author Alexandra Deschamps-Sonsino. So yeah, just a final piece that please add any questions to the Q&A. We hope that you have fun. We hope that you have a lot of dialogue. And yeah, over to us. John.
Thank you, Rob. I likewise very happy to be here. My name's John. As Rob says, we run the Futures Through Design short course. Next edition's coming up in March. And I also run Smithery, which is a strategic design practice here in the UK. I would like to invite Charlie to introduce herself as well, with her new updated job title, as we've just seen on the chat. So, Charlie, hello, who are you?
Hello. I am Charlie Warwick and I'm dialing in from London, but I have a global foresight role, so leading global foresight in Arup. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Arup, it's a large sustainable development consultancy, so specializing in engineering and development and design of anything in the built environment and increasingly in our synthetic digital environment too. So thinking engineering, designing, but we have this dedicated foresight practice of global futurists and practitioners. So I'll leave it there. Very excited to get into this topic of this design futures intersection. Back to you, John.
Thank you. Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I am a consultant right now working with the Energy Systems Catapult, which is based in Birmingham. I'm with their living lab, so we'll probably get into what that means as part of this conversation, but have a background in design, so we'll probably be occupying the design territory for the purposes of this conversation. It's not a boxing match, but I kind of feel like it is. Yeah.
It's not a boxing match. So, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Rob. One thing that has been in our prep for this talk and initial discussions over the last 10 years, we've been increasingly watching the spheres of design and futures and foresight come together, start overlapping. Is it merging? Is it some sort of like eclipsing partial moon thing and so on? And so we really want to bring to brilliant people from design and futures together to talk about sort of like what do we see in these disciplines which are the same, what are different, how are they complementary, how do they butt up against each other as a boxing match, Alex? So maybe I'll sort of start with the first question. Sort of it's not so much sort of like what you're working on or where you work, but when are you working? When it comes to looking out to the future, how far out are you looking, and how far out are the people you work with tending to look as well? Let's start with Alex.
Thanks. I think the when you're working is really critical because I think the last few years of my career, actually almost all of my career, has been about the short term. It will be heavily defined by what my environment needs, which is usually something to do with the next quarter, usually. At a push, it might be this financial year, but that changes, it even changes half yearly. And I think in my world, people's ambitions is very short-termist. There needs to be a thing that gets made quite quickly. It needs to be valuable quite quickly, and it needs to be made with the information available today. Maybe with a bit of positing around what the information might be about in the next few weeks, month ahead. Maybe a policy is about to drop. Maybe a paper is about to be written. But it's very, very holdable, let's say. It doesn't mean that it's secure, and it doesn't mean that things are perceivable it could be 500 years in the future sometimes, it feels like, but it's the horizon I usually work at is very, very close.
And so is it coming? I'm interested in sort of is it just as short term as it always has been? Is it felt like it's getting even more short term, or is it getting more uncertain? What's to use what the kids use? What's the vibe?
I don't think that kids use the vibe anymore. I'm sure we've advanced past that. It's probably got something to do with 6 and 7. But I think my role and the place I'm sort of comfortable in, so maybe it might be about me and the work that I tend to be attracted by, is not so much the churning of the things that we already know how to do, but it's in the let me make a difference now, and let me make a difference on a brief now, or with a client now, or the environment now, and let me try to move the needle in some way. And I think that means acting quite quickly. And so I think it's partly to do with me and partly to do with the work that I um, tend to be attracted to. I
Mm.
think when, and Charlie can speak to this a bit more, when things start to get too abstracted, I personally lose interest as a designer. I just kind of go, well, I don't really have control over those conditions. I can't really see where I would interact as an individual. And so I just leave it to the professionals in that sphere in a way, because I really want to get into the detail. And the first link drop that I will make as part of this is one of my favorite essays I found very recently is an essay called Reality Has, gosh, I'm going to rubbish the name now, but reality has a certain degree of detail. And I think that shapes design practice. It's like the devil's in the detail. The devil is in the immediate machinery of the thing you're trying to do, whether that machinery is policy making or that machinery is the team that you're in and the mood that they're in, whether it's the budget that you're in, whether it's the stakeholder and how they're feeling, how your clients, feeling about their bit of the business. All of that is machinery that I can kind of get into, and I really get excited by that. As soon as those things sort of fall away, because there's carte blanche and freedom in a way. I drown in the freedom. I don't enjoy it at all.
Of all the possible things that might happen, what's the one to concentrate on? So Charlie, same question, but obviously a different time period. When are you working?
So I can see why you have matched us together for the purposes of this conversation. So I say Foresight exists within Arup, who are, collective of 20,000 engineers designing the future built environment. So there is an acknowledgement in the kind of core of the business that what we are designing will outlive us and our children and grandchildren. And there's a really wonderful kind of sensibility across the organization for designing kind of outcomes or consequences rather than designing buildings. And that is something that really kind of captured my imagination and interest when I first found out about Arup. So the time horizon that we're typically working on, I mean, we have major infrastructure projects that are, Alexandra was saying things don't take long to get built in her world. Things take years, often decades, to get built in ours. And the expectation is that they would still be there, or some imprint of those things would still be there in hundreds of years. So in some cases, we are taking a decade, if not kind of century-long outlook for the impact that those design interventions will have on our built and biophysical environment. But what I would say is, in spite of taking that long-term time horizon and the wide range of uncertainty and possibility that opens up for us as foresighters, the devil is still in the detail. So I really like what you said about that. And part of our work as foresighters in this setting is drawing out those speculative details of what it actually feels like to live, work, exist alongside other species in these future places. and to actually bring some kind of color and richness and a feeling of reality to what it would mean for that place to be safe, resilient, and regenerative, which is Arup's ultimate purpose statement, to deliver safe, resilient, and regenerative places for current and future generations to thrive. So I totally agree that you can't hope to edit or change behaviors and design decisions today, like immediately, without that kind of emotional engagement with our long-term futures. And we can talk a bit more about how we try to not make it too academic an exercise. And that is really where design, I would say, comes into our practice.
So just to ask a follow-up question on that then, the sort of like, as you've gone through Arup and places you've been before as well, so are you increasingly aware of design as a way of making these potential things more concrete? And
Yeah.
How is that helping the things we face in the present?
Yeah, it was a bit of a eureka. I've had a few eureka moments since being here and working with such a talented bunch of kind of design-led or design-oriented folks. So yes, I would say that. So previously, I've done a bunch of kind of strategy consulting for companies you probably would have heard of. Also did a stint in the UK government leading on futures advice there, so working in the policy space. I would say in both of those settings, there was a real reliance on very structured methodologies, which I can understand when you're dealing with a lot of overwhelming uncertainty. So there was a lot of framework, a lot of conversation guide, a lot of I suppose matrices and spectra and all of those tools, but actually not really dependence on the tools or approaches that you would associate with design expertise and profession. And what we have now in Arup is almost a design first approach to futuring, which is if we have the bare bones of some future conditions, say biophysical or climate conditions, some demographic conditions, relative contextual parameters, it becomes immediately interesting to start world building through a sort of design process. What tool would I need to engage with? What would my needs be in the home? How would my child interact with nature? Like all of these sort of questions related to the minutiae of living and working. From this, it's a sort of research, a design research exercise, really. It can be seen as research through design into what else might be in those futures and the sorts of values that might surface, the sorts of technologies that might take unexpected trajectories or applications. So we are really doing futures research through design in what we do. So yes, definitely to your question, John, I have been on my own learning journey in terms of the coming together of these two fields and what one can bring to the other.
So to bring this, I might bring Rob in a minute for a question as well. But the sort of to come back to Alex then, have you seen increasingly sort of like in the design space, people, I feel like people have been sort of talking about deploying using futures increasingly over like 5-10 year period to greater and lesser extent, as to greater and lesser effectiveness and so on. Is it sort of like, do you feel that designers are wanting to work on this stuff more? Does it help push out a little further to sort of like just begin to think about the different challenges we're facing, to spot some of these trends which are impact decisions that were bound in that first quarter, first year, whatever? Are we seeing a broadening of the kind of like design community to that?
I'm going to answer in a lateral kind of way, and I would love Charlie's view on this. Is I think we've created the opportunity for a very small set of design specialists who work in speculative futures-based work. I've seen the deepening of those practices, and those practices, include people like Superflux and others. But I can't see necessarily a proliferation of those studios. I don't necessarily see it's not a growth market, I don't think, for smaller studios. I think it's a growth market for larger organizations that have enough research DNA in them to then, add on different tools and different methods and different methodologies. Now, who's got enough R&D DNA to hold on to their R&D more than X number of years? It's not everyone. We've seen in the last, since I started work in 2006, lots and lots of people lost R&D departments that were decades old, that were huge, sort of research arms of major corporations. And so I think that there's maybe what's happened is those folks in those research arms ended up creating small studios that we now see today, or the students of those folks. But I don't necessarily see the tools being standardized, the methods being that legible if you're not in that world. And the utility of them, I think, therefore becomes really tied to the identity of those studios. So you end up wanting to work with that studio because of the work that they do rather than the method they're using or the underlying framework that they're applying. But that's my view on it.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to that, I would agree, and I'm less close to the design space, obviously, than you guys are. But what I am seeing in incredibly exciting and encouraging ways are new sorts of practice that are borrowing from the design world and the futures world, but not really calling themselves either, and sort of like loosing the shackles of some of those kind of methodological norms, but taking principles from both. So, I mean, just to highlight some of the awesome practitioners who are in the next generation Foresight practitioner network. So this is an incredible network of award winners, essentially, who have submitted various projects, and the portfolio of projects that exist there really do show the diversity of ways that design and foresight techniques can be smashed together, again, in very outcome-led ways. So I would say what unites all of the projects is there was an outcome in a specific community, and all of the sort of borrowings from design and foresight were all in aid of that outcome. So again, in the Link Fest, I'll make sure this gets to everyone, a portfolio of some of these projects, because they're great examples of wholly new approaches that take from both communities.
And that's really interesting from the point of view of people sort of like because there's something in obviously design thinking is design thinking and futures thinking is futures thinking, but there's something that kind of like maps across them both, and innovation where you go, it's all the same kind of thinking. It's all the sort of like, how do we granularize things, pull it apart, reassemble it in different ways, but then use it to ask questions and inquire about circumstances and think about outcomes we want. I think the sort of like when you think about participatory design and participatory futures, we're both talking about sort of like how do you involve the people whose futures and whose designs these are, so that they can actually sort of like, take some agency in the kind of like the next month, the next year, and not have to wait 10 years for, oh, don't worry, the future will come along, it'll be fine, we promise.
Can I just voice a concern there? Just and I'm sure Charlie has a view on this. I really worry when we over diversify definitions and language around what we do, because I feel like we're always at a risk of confusing our clients and confusing our market about where we work. So I wonder, whether these new and emerging studios, the fact that they're not choosing to call themselves futures or design futurists or speculative designers or whatever the terminology might be, whether that helps them or it helps us or it harms us in general, because then you get some of the questions that we, for example, have in the chat right now, which is, what's the difference between a futurist and a strategist? And, we start to sort of get caught up in what I would call the, kind of design psychodrama. which is, there's a lot of psychodrama in design circles where we're always just kind of in this anxiety, constant anxiety of who we are, what place we take in relation to engineers, marketers, salespeople, and we're always kind of going, oh, this is me and this is my territory. And so I wonder whether the hyper diffusion of language and proliferation of 12 different ways to call ourselves practitioners helps or doesn't.
And this is a challenge that we come up against daily because everybody in Arup would call themselves in some capacity a designer. That means totally different things to different people. And when we talk about design-led futures, quite often people don't get the right end of the stick. I guess the question always, and I don't think this just applies to our field, is it about the desired end, or is it about the means to the end? Like, how much does the means to the end matter, in terms of like how sort of protective do we want to be over terminologies and methodologies? I mean, I think for people finding their way into this, and we'd all agree on this call that it's a really kind of valid, valuable approach to achieving better outcomes. So for people to find their way into this world, we need to label ourselves in some way. But I think this is a really live debate we have amongst our team all the time. I mean, Rob or John, like in this design world, in the world of education, right, where we're having to put labels on things, what would you say?
Yeah, I think just building on that, I mean, my background, I suppose, is slightly different because I came from industrial practice, then worked through a PhD, and still do that and work live with UKRI projects. And I think there's always been a tension between industrial practice and students. And so industrial practice wants to be in an institution where the boundaries of the work are almost limitless, and then vice versa, students want to be in industry. And so sometimes there's this tension between what they're calling themselves, how they're working, and sometimes how they're just framing their work. Like, make cool work that is interesting and that you stand by, and that changes the world or moves it forwards. And I think it's one thing that's a luxury at the RCA is that you're able to discuss and debate with students. For example, you've got everything detailed from IDE or design product students all the way to DF, where you're looking at tiny detail, but then you're looking at systemic change. And I think the most important thing is having an informed view. So, like, how are you looking at that space? How are you understanding that and starting to understand actually what your role could be? And that's always the interesting tension. And I think that's the difference between, again, briefs that we have in an academic space. Within our students, I never tell them what they can't do. I give them the floor, not the ceiling. Whereas quite often the reverse in industrial practice, they'll go, this is the ceiling, this is what it's going to cost, this is like, and so I talk to our students about that sort of stuff all the time. And I think it's it's critical. And I think sometimes you just have to take a position, because you have to be able to move forwards. And I think the hardest thing that we have with our student body is that sometimes people won't like the work you do, and that is okay. It might not scale, it might work in that particular place, and that's okay. So kind of it's interesting, and the Design Council is navigating this again, what is a designer? And I think sometimes it's good for us just to be super hyper clear about this is what we think it is, you think it's something different, great. How do those things come together?
And so it's so context specific, I guess, in a way. And this comes back to the thing that unites all of your perspectives there, I think, is this idea of change or outcomes. It's sort of like we can identify something that we want to do. Context specifically, how do we do it? And therefore, it almost in a way it's kind of sort of like I will call myself whatever I need to call myself to get to the point that we can make the change for people, with people, by people that they need, with a client, by a client, for a client, in a certain way. You sort of like it's kind of like you go, if we get stuck on the labels, we just prevent the change from becoming possible. So how do you? I think this is to Alex's very practical point. It's kind of like, without going down the sort of like the salami slicing of different roles and different things, and sort of like, I'm a specific speculative design futurist strategist. You go sort of like, okay, what are we trying to do? and over what time period and with what? Alex, you were going to come in there.
No, I was just going to say, I think this is why I sort of talked about Ed Ruscha's fantastic print slash painting, which says something to the effect of people preparing themselves to do things. I think 90% of design work is to create the conditions for the design work to take place. And so in some instances, for example, the contract I have now, but also more recently, I can walk into rooms and I never describe myself as a designer because I know that people will have a visceral reaction to design work on the basis of a history of design practices they might have interacted with. I don't want to be painted with that brush. And so there's not a single post-it to be seen. I'm not using Miro, mural, whatever. I'm just talking to people and getting their motivation up for me to lead them through the next piece of work. And I think part of the futuring in my practice, if we can, is to, or if I can kind of call it that, is to create an environment where people talk about risks, people talk about the reasons why this project will fail, and we can just, chew on that for a bit in order to understand where the kind of potholes might be on the road. We can noodle around a risk register if it makes someone really happy, because in some instances, the client will be really happy if there's a risk register. And then you can go and well, what about and what if? But only once you've done that first bit of work. And I think that's the kind of grubby administrative bit of trust making that I think is not often documented in futures work.
I love what you were saying about the kind of necessary prep. And to me, this is another facet of design thinking in the context of doing futures work, which is the design of a process, an experience, a journey that you and others are going to go on together, that ultimately you are you hold responsibility for being the kind of guide through this process. And so often in foresight work, we say that the product is the process. We all know how powerful experiential embodied learning can be. And so much of the value created in doing foresight is when you are guiding people through the process and they have these moments of realization through engaging with the methods. So the design of an experience, and I would extend this to spatial design, even the sort of physical space in which you're having this engagement, the virtual space in which you're having the engagement, that all matters. The design of that matters. Even to the point of understanding your role as a foresight person. I kind of liken myself to an ice cube tray sometimes, that I'm there to hold a space and to give kind of form and structure to experiences and expertise and knowledge that is swimming amongst these people, in a watery way that needs to be given some kind of useful form. So in that respect, the design part of foresight is not in the sort of jazzy world building and speculative artifact creation. It's actually in what design principles do we need to apply to this space, to this experience, to this group of people to get this level of kind of imagination unlock and alignment. So that prep work, the sort of wider holistic design work there is an important facet of this for me.
Can I just pick up on something that you've just said, which is also, I think about by doing that prep work and kind of context preparation for people, you're also helping them buy into the thing that they're going to be making together with you, right? So I think that there's a sort of care element there that I think helps ideas, visions, any future work, i.e. any work together, kind of stick from day one. And I think whether it's 500 years in the future because you're master planning something in the middle of the desert, or you've got a presentation for next month because end of quarter whatnots. I think it's all massively essential. And I think if you could be the best producer of beautiful AI generated, fantasy worlds, if nobody knows, why that came together, they haven't met you, they weren't in the room, they're going to look at this and they're going to go in exactly the same way that they would look at a PowerPoint they haven't, they don't know the author of, and they don't know where it came from, and they just stumbled across it in Teams Drive by Googling the word future. They'll go like, what's this? So I think there's a social connection and a social glue to all of this work, whether it's design work or futures work.
Something, so two things on this. So one, there's a great book by Bruce and Stephanie Tharp called Discursive Design, which talks to this a lot. It's basically goes like, these are ways in which you have those vital conversations. The thing is not a thing beyond the idea that sort of it draws people into the conversation. It pulls the things out from various different parts of organizations, cultures, communities, whatever it happens to be, so that you can go, okay, so what is this really when we have it, this dialogic discussion around it? And then the second thing, I was just going to show quickly if I can find it, but on the Futures Through Design course, we use this thing called 3 Futures frames, which just moves. It's a really simple design zoom out, zoom in thing that you go, yes, you're going to be working on scenarios, but you've got inputs down the bottom, then you can get one up the top, but then you bring it down to the space and you go, what is the situation in which this occurs? And then you bring it down again to the stuff, and then you make the thing, but then you zoom back out again, and then you go, okay, but that thing you've just made, where was it bought from? Which factory was it built in? Where's it going to be recycled? And you go, I don't know that yet. And you go, okay, so think about those situations. And then you go, so which signals don't you have? And there's one question that students tend to ask. It's sort of like, oh, but when do you know when you're finished? Like, because you can just, like, you could continually zoom in and zoom out all the time here. And it's kind of like, you're finished when the thing you're trying to change changes. It's not a kind of like, oh, I've done one magic design artifact and therefore that's from the future, brilliant. The magical kind of like AI generated thing. It's kind of like, it's just a representation of the discussion that is ongoing and the change that you are moving towards.
Can I just poke a tiny, not a hole at this, but just a tiny thing
Totally.
in here? It's so typical of me to bust everybody's balloons. Anyway, my second link drop is this paper I'm actually holding because I'm old school. I have a printer, which will be dropped in the notes. But it's Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, which my old colleague Guy Hilton sent to me at 4 a.m. on a Sunday the other day. And it's just absolutely a wonderful view on what you might call systems thinking, systemic design, but written in 1973 when all of that world was emerging. And what is, you could highlight tons of things in there, but a really nice one-liner is social problems are never solved. At best, they are only resolved over and over again. And I think that talks to some of the questions in the chat about failure, redoing work, revisiting a brief, coming back to a brief constantly over and over again. And I've worked with clients who have recommissioned the same piece of work 4 times in a row. That just happens. And I think we have to live with that. We have to live with that in design all the time. I imagine Charlie's relationship to it is slightly different, but I think this idea that things are finished at any given point is, it's different in the built environment than it is in a piece of AI work, or again, someone made a PowerPoint, someone took 3 slides out and added a whole bunch of gunk, and you weren't there when they presented it to so-and-so. And so there is a aliveness to the work and a malleability to the work that means that you, at best, are offloading a thing that you know in one form once, and then it lives on, or it dies in a Google Drive somewhere. But it kind of just, you can only know it as finished from your perspective at that point. It might have its own future. So in a way, to talk about futures, it might have its own future because 3 people down the line, someone does something with it you never anticipated. So an example, practical example of that, is I helped organize an event in 2012. 2 years later, someone very high up at an OEM turned to me and said, "Oh, we realigned completely our internal view on open source based on that event." And there was absolutely no signal of that, of any kind. And so the thing I helped make, which was a set of open source principles for the Internet of Things at the time in 2012, then has some corporate repercussions somewhere in a corner that influences the way in which products around the world are delivered. And so you kind of just learn how to sit with that. You go, cool, and you just move on to the next thing.
It's the sort of like it's the creating the possibility for those for other people to make those abductive leaps. And this is not the forum in which to go into abductive, deductive, inductive, but you know what I mean? It's just kind of like the sort of like people sort of like you create things and you've got no idea of sort of like the what will happen inside a business you're working with, or a client base, or a customer base. But some people will see a thing and then it becomes part of the recombinant possible future that they can take and make something else, and then something happens as a result. We are going to go through the questions, I think, in 2 minutes, and
Yeah, I was gonna jump on. I've been having a little nosy. There are a couple in there to do with futures methods, so maybe I can just jump on and kind of shoot a couple of those in one go. So what are the methods, matrices, spectra, frameworks you find most useful? And someone else asking about hearing more about futures methods, using them for research and making futures more tangible. So I guess I don't want to make any assumptions about the level of futures literacy with the crew of people listening in to this, but there are some amazing kind of foundational building blocks, I would say, to starting a futures practice, and some very established tools and techniques. And so link drop alert, there's a great curation of the best futures toolkits done by a social innovation outfit called Nesta, who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So maybe we can drop that in for you. Just like any other practitioner, I kind of fall in and out of love with various techniques. And at the moment, the one that's really my kind of champion technique is the Three Horizons methodology, which it looks like these two intersecting lines and then a hump in the middle. And I'm sure some of you have seen this. Again, I'll grab a link for you guys. But what this forces us to ask in a kind of beautifully objective, neutral way is not just about the weak signals of the future, the kind of early signs of change that we see today in our Horizon 1, that over time will scale and mainstream and grow and become our dominant norm by the time we hit Horizon 3. I think that sort of novelty and growth and scale is something people think about a lot. But the other flip side that Three Horizons helps you to think through is the norms, the things that are dominant, the values, the behaviors, the frameworks of today, that over time will lose relevance and value. And actually, we can take active steps towards dismantling, ex-novating rather than innovating, which I kind of dislike as a term, but it is clear. Divesting from, phasing out and stepping away from, so that by the time we're in Horizon 3, those things are just a sort of legacy kind of fossil of what was. So I love this framework, and particularly when it comes to helping with world building and the sort of design research processes, not just all the novelty that will be there, but the legacy kind of infrastructure and behaviors and things that feel a bit kind of nostalgic or quirky or retro by the time we get to Horizon 3. So that's a snippet of a method I love at the moment, but would encourage you to dig into the toolkits.
I'll pick a really difficult question from Alistair. Hello, who's a good friend of mine. So, can we mitigate damage of promised futures that aren't delivered as they rot and become the fuel stuff of resentments that are exploited by politicians? Easy question. My thought on that is kind of the difference between big society and the garden bridge. So I think we inherit lots of different ideas of the future. We inherit lots of different views of the future, but some of them are more illustrated than others. And I think as soon as they become illustrated, whether it's a video, CGI render, as soon as there's a sort of visual design effort, we remember them more, I think. And I think that's a bit of a designerly curse. I think every time we make something a bit pretty, then we're kind of saying this will totally happen. And everybody who's ever worked with prototyping and who's ever worked with user experience processes and UI design, it's always that tender moment of very soft middle between something that's a bit too sketchy and doesn't look credible and something that looks just right, but not right enough to overpromise. And I think that's where that future sort of horizon of, how much future is too much future so that you're kind of drowning in the promise of the thing. Oh, but you said it would be beautiful and there would be cascading flows of, trees everywhere. And then once it's delivered, all the trees in winter make it look really gloomy. I think every time there's a visual element, I don't think we hold that. We don't hold that lightly. We don't hold that emotion very in the same way when it's like a white paper that was published, and that was published 20 years ago that said some ridiculous things about the future of healthcare in the country or whatever it might be. We sort of forget about those, but we always remember the garden bridge. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can jump on that one as well, because I love what you were saying about nuance and that liminality of kind of what feels utopian versus what feels more emotionally resonant. I would also just take a kind of step back from this idea of futures as artifacts that can be and are used by different actors with different agendas. And I think this is what's kind of behind your question, Alistair. So there have been promised futures, but there are also very magnetic futures that are being realized. And I don't want to get, super political in this discussion, but there's a brilliant perspective shared by Rutger Bregman, who's a Dutch philosopher and economist. He spoke in the Reef Lectures last year. Again, another link drop coming at you. Episode 1, he spoke about essentially the challenge of politics when leaders and their perspectives on the third horizon, the long-term future, are either irrelevant or aren't even there. So there's a complacency in a lot of the sort of politics of our time in a lot of places around the world where people haven't bothered to imagine and construct and design preferred futures that can be magnetic and galvanizing. Other ideologies, other factions, other parties are doing that, and those futures are being used, and they're taking the space of other futures that might have been used had they been imagined. And so there's a really interesting sort of void created in the third horizon for certain ideologies that is being exploited by others. And so, Alistair, a little bit of a tangent on the sort of promised futures versus other futures that are used, and sometimes the kind of absence of promised futures as well.
Can I just pick up on that last bit, which is, do you also think it's about the difference between, in my circles, it might be radical innovation versus incremental innovation? Everybody always loves to dream big. And so radical innovation sells, whereas incremental innovation is the thing that actually we all end up, some building works are happening outside of my house. That's going to fix the thing that's leaking. That's like repair and maintenance. Nobody wants to think about repair and maintenance work, but everybody's always ready for a big story of radical change. And I think that definitely gets people to vote. But does it get you, your clients, and does it get you kind of people attracted by that radical change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I also think the three horizons is a useful way to think about this as well. in the foresight work we do, we're constantly translating across these three horizons. You have to be like thinking in these multiple horizon terms all the time. So the boldness of the description or the visualization of the new paradigm is always going to get people excited, you're right. But what we're finding ourselves talking about in the context of the built environment is the redefinition of things like safety and resilience. So resilience does not equal hard, robust, impermeable, impenetrable longevity. Resilience equals soft maintenance, more investment in OPEX, that is operating costs, versus CapEx, that is initial capital expenditure. Big questions or kind of assumptions that have underpinned this whole industry for decades. And so in this translation exercise, we're thinking about big ideas of paradigm shifts over time, but having to communicate them as small incremental changes in maybe not putting a big flood defense there, but thinking about working with the ingress or egress of water in the fenlands. Examples like that are just micro interventions, but add up to a bigger paradigm shift. So I think you need both, Alex. There's a fine balance.
Yeah, I think just chucking in that, I think something that we talk about with our students and we talk about in our projects, almost like the future Monday as well. Like, what does it mean for this place? And I think there is something really interesting, that big vision that everyone does want. But sometimes it's actually, do you know what? How should we really be looking at plumbing in 10 years? Why? Because plumbing and water is everything. And the next world wars are probably going to be fought over water and all these everything that becomes terrifying cascades. And yeah, I think all too often, these kind of mass images of like huge change. Whereas actually when you start to look at the kind of trades and the impact on trades and how we work and how we make work, it's how things cascade. So another thing that we talk about in Ecological Citizens and kind of, again, with our students is kind of how we design the conditions and how we create the conditions for other people to appropriate. Because one thing I think that's really important, this is my personal view, I don't know people's cultures. I don't know their situations, their challenges. And I think it's really important that that we work and develop and kind of go, this worked here. How can we learn from what works in different places? Because I think that for me, that's always been the biggest challenge that design has gone through, is people knowing. So, and it's just actually, this is how we've done it. How do you do that? How do you explore it as a culture? Anyway, back to you guys on the questions.
Can I pick the thing that seems very popular, which we've cleverly avoided, but I think is impossible to avoid, which is, how has AI changed the way you design futures? I'll talk about my experience of AI and work in the last few years, both with my clients and with my colleagues as well, is I am really in this kind of interesting moment where I think people are setting some expectations about AI. And they're trying, I think, to sort of repaint the town with AI in terms of their R&D activities. So their R&D functions are hiring, new directors that have AI in the job title. And I think that's absolutely fascinating because it's no longer, machine learning and LLMs on their own. It's sort of this umbrella term for all of these questions that people have, because R&D functions are really great ways of identifying where people have questions. And so I think the way in which it's changed my world as a consultant, my world as an employee, is just going, okay, what do you think it means? And going and asking people to define it institutionally, because inevitably everybody's culture has a take on it, and it has a take on what it is, what it can do, what time it can save, what investment it might require financially, and just to understand what flavor of AI you're talking about in order to then go, okay, this is the flavor of AI you're talking about, okay, in this flavor of AI, maybe there's a job to be done here. But it sort of added an extra layer of question on my side. So it's no longer, you want to work with computers, you have some websites, you have some people using those websites, everybody's on Teams, Slack, Google Meet, plus a bunch of random tools that you don't quite know what to do with. It's okay, well, what do you think AI is in your context? And then getting people to kind of unwrap that in order to set the tone for the work that you might do as a consultant and the value you might bring right there and then. But there's no, in my experience for my clients, there's no sort of universal uptake of any tools. There's no universal understanding of what the tools mean for every single institution. There's a sort of highly bespoke vision of what the tools mean for each and every client that I've had.
I think I'm further from the technical kind of understanding here, but I can speak to the conversation we're having about, let's come back to the sort of designers that exist in a firm like Arup. And obviously this is an existential question that we're asking about the role of AI and its interface with designers of the built environment. The question about the value of the design process or the designer as a human in the kind of whole project process is people are sort of squidged to the edges of that process. So let's say the real value is bookending the AI-led or enhanced process. So for us, that's can we ask better questions, more critical questions about what good looks like for this thing? Can we function a bit like a red team, if you know this expression, a sort of challenger function that unpicks some of the assumptions under this brief? Can we deliberately invite in divergent perspectives or source material or references in the upfront? Granted, there's no escaping that a lot of the traditional design process can be automated, carried out, enhanced by different AI tools. But then the really interesting bit for me is the value that comes in the risk that is taken on at the end of the process and the liability assumption for people in the built environment. You know, who is going to guarantee that this thing will operate in the way that it was designed to? And does that also fall to this kind of class of machines and software? Or do we still need a human in the loop for liability? Now, if we want to get a little bit more stretchy about that, if we're thinking about the construction of futures as artifacts and things that can be used, can we apply the same sort of bookending? I've no doubt there'll be AI tools around. There already are for world building and scenario analysis. And so how are we asking better questions about what to explore and how, and what value frameworks are being applied? And then are we taking some kind of responsibility for those futures and how they're shared and consumed and used? And I would welcome any thoughts from anybody on that one, because I haven't got much further with my thinking.
Just to pick that up, the sort of I found that, and it's sort of like, and it comes into Jason's question as well, a little bit, sort of like it's given us easier and quicker to get tangible with lesser skill, etc. It feels like AI in futures is kind of like, have you just displaced the discussion and the questions and the thinking? And I've been for like 9 months or something, I've been writing around cognitive debt. So cognitive debt is just the equivalent of technical debt. It's like where you have the answers, but you haven't done the thinking. I think what this session has shown is sort of like how crucial it is to have the questions, to have the thinking, to put them in specific places with people so that you go, we understand this. There's no point generating endless scenarios and sort of like asking LLMs to go and find 120 different signals, which you then have to check 120 of. You might as well have gone looking for them. So there's this thing of sort of like it's pushing and it's molding and it's changing where those questions are asked. We still have to ask them. We still have to have those discussions in order to work out what kind of future we want.
Can I also say, I think it's also interesting to see what the long term of those activities are, because churn in organizations has increased in the last 10 years. So you might be doing a piece of AI work if the underlying questions are not documented and the underlying reasoning is not documented and nobody's reading it because they're putting it through your version of Claude, ChatGPT, or whatnot, then you're sort of creating internal cultural layers of slop, of like admin slop around this work. That's really also interesting. What are we going to do with a colleague's AI work 3 years after they've left the business? And I think that's where the kind of what's your internal future scenario around that future's work? Because if it's not digestible, and again, it comes back to, are you making pretty pictures for it? Because if you're not, someone's probably not going to read the 60-page PDF that you've auto-generated, and someone's probably not going to go back to the links that you link to in that 60-page PDF.
Thank you. We have time for one minute before we wrap up. If Charlie or Alex wanted any wrap up.
Well, God, at the risk of opening such a huge can of worms, 1 minute to the end of this session. Anonymous has said, any advice for a design-led futures approach for systems in crisis, such as homelessness? I mean, in short, to answer this one, ideas and theories of interdependence are entering the foresight world at a rate of knots. And they've always been there in some kind of corners and pockets of futures communities. But the notion that kind of a systems thinking, futures thinking, and design thinking approach can kind of fuse this like beautiful trifecta of approaches to tackling some of these really tough systemic issues, which all boil down to our interdependence on one another, on other things, materials, species, entities. So what we're trying to do now is get better at creating proxies for how the health of another actor in the system has an impact on our own health, or generally ecological, economic, and social health outcomes. Because if health is the ultimate success metric or an ultimate outcome for a lot of audiences, then that sort of interdependence is something you need to bring to light. And I think design, like visual design, can play a huge role in unlocking or sort of bringing to light some of those interdependencies that are very difficult to describe in words. I'll stop there.
I'm less enthusiastic as a true designer, just because again that sentence from the paper I referenced earlier, social problems are not solved, they are resolved over and over again. And I think thinking about that, I really recommend you read the paper. There was the Design Against Crime unit that was created, I think, almost 15 years ago. And clearly we haven't solved crime. So I think knowing, again, the limits of what we can do is really powerful, and just intervening where we think we might have an impact, but it's probably not where we'd like. I think it's the work of a lifetime.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for everybody who's joined us today. Charlie and Alexandra, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. It's really interesting and also quite brave, because the different things are always at tension, which is great. I think as soon as we can agreeably disagree, things start to change and move us forwards, and I think that's wonderful. It's what I encourage my students to do with me. So if you're interested in some of the themes or aspects that we're talking about, obviously we'll try and follow up with as many questions where possible based on people's time and what they're doing. We're also hosting our next Futures Through Design course, and I've just put details of that in the chat. We will share a link of the recording for everyone who's registered, and just want to thank you for your time and have a wonderful Tuesday. Awesome. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.